All right. So just want to make certain before I begin, everybody online can see the PowerPoint. Is that correct? Mr. Garrett, can you see it? Can you let me know?
Yes, sir, I can.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. All right. So this evening we're going to go ahead and we are going to begin lecture. We're going to start with the Texas Promulgated Forms. Dealing with the second edition is what we're dealing with. And we're going to start off with contract law overview. All right. So those of you that have been in a previous class with mine, we've already discussed this. We've already went through contract law in the previous lecture. So this should be a refresher for some of you. For others of you, this may be your first time. Okay, and this is completely a brand new course for you, and you're joining in. So this is a completely new field for you, and it's going to provide you an overview of the basis of contract law. So the learning objectives that we're going to complete this evening is going to be to identify the essential elements of a valid contract. We're going to explain the difference in valid, void, voidable, and unenforceable contracts. And we're also going to distinguish between what's called bilateral and unilateral, as well as executed and executory contracts. Lastly, we'll describe the reasonable time, and the time is of the essence as they apply within the Texas real estate contracts, and identify which contract forms contain the phrase time is of the essence. So those are going to be our objectives for this evening. So if you have taken law of contracts already, you already have known this information. So this is a refresher for you. If you have not taken this, this is kind of going to give you the steps. So when you get to law of contracts, this is going to basically wrap up or sum up the entire class. So we're also going to jump in some of the additional learning objectives that have been added on, where it's basically the distinguishment between an amendment and an addendum, and describes how and when we're actually going to use them. We're going to state the statute of limitations for written and oral contracts in Texas, and we're also going to list the reasons for termination of contract, including your breach of contracts. So with that being said, we're going to go on and jump in to this evening. And the key thing here that we're going to be talking about is basically the elements, okay? The key thing in any type of situation with a contract is that you must meet every single element of a contract. You must have all of these different things that we're talking about. However, to begin, we need to have an understanding of what exactly is a contract. Like, what exactly does it all entail? Well, as we know, a contract is basically, it's a legal performance, it's an enforceable performance to either do something or not do something, okay? So, for example, in this class, I've got a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, and so I'm going to be able to use a lot more examples in this class, which I enjoy. But say, for example, I have a couple of you that are college students, I have a couple of you that are older individuals that are out of those partying ages. But let's say for this situation that, for example, Mr. Wyatt and Mr. Jarrett here in my classroom today, they both decide that they are going in and that that they're roommates, okay? Y'all two are roommates in this particular situation. And Mr. Stephen and Mr. Travis, they're older individuals, they're out of their partying days, but they live right next door to Mr. Jarrett and Mr. Wyatt. Now, Mr. Jarrett, being a DJ, he's always practicing, he's outside, he's got his speakers out, and he's just partying all the time, 24/7, and they're constantly throwing parties. Now, Mr. Travis and Mr. Stephen, they're older individuals. Do y'all want to end up, Mr. Travis and Mr. Stephen, do you want to live next to somebody that is constantly, 24/7, the parties constantly in and out, 24/7? Y'all want to live in a place like that?
No. Not if I'm old.
Not if you're old. So instead of most people, what do? They call the cops, right? Well, that's one way of handling it. But what's actually a better method of handling it? What do you think would be a better method, Jared? If you're the one that's partying and all, do you want the cops calling on you?
No.
No, not at all, do you? because you don't want to have a bad reputation with the cops.
Right.
Would you prefer that Mr. Travis or Mr. Stephen come over and say, hey man, you're being too loud, you know, I'll give you $100 if you just quiet it down from this time to this time.
Yeah.
You be cool with that?
Yes.
That is a forbearance contract. They are asking you to forbear what you have a legal right to do. Okay? So in that situation is sometimes just going over to the other party and saying simply like, hey, could you cut it down, please? I mean, you know, what can we work out? You know, what can I do to work out and so forth and so on where everybody's happy. So that's one legally enforceable agreement is that you can actually do what is not to do. You can actually ask them not to do something. Another thing is, Travis, you may ask Jarek, hey, I don't want you to throw parties between, say, 10 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the morning, okay? That's what you want him not to do. But he asked you that he would like for you to end up, in exchange, he'll stop it, but he would like you to do him a favor. He wants you to come over, he'll stop partying, if you would end up going over and mowing his side of the yard for him. He'll stop doing that if you just mow just about a couple more feet over to help him out. If you mow that yard, then y'all got a fair deal here. Is that cool with you? Well, what's happened is if you agree to that, we now have a forbearance and we have a performance. You're asking him to stop, but you're asking him to do something. So in this situation, you have two contracts going at one time. You see how this works? But all contracts fall under these two things. To either do something or not to do something. All contracts are that simple. Okay, no matter what it is, it's either do something or not to do something. Now, of course, if these are agreements, they're of course going to be binding and enforceable. If both parties agree to it, we have a binding and enforceable contract, meaning you must do what you promised. If you don't do what you promised, say, Jared, you go throw a party right after you and Travis agreed to something, and you start throwing a party, well, what ends up happening in that particular situation is you breached your contract. And now, in this particular situation, Travis, you could sue Jared for failing to do what he promised. Okay? So very, very interesting on how this works out. Now, this is the most important part right here. Okay? These are actually the elements that you have to have a valid contract. If you don't have one of these elements, the contract is void. Does that make sense? So if any one of these 6 items are missing, it's void. It's not even enforceable. So say, for example, that Travis, you went over and you asked Jared to stop, and you're 16, and you go over and ask him to stop, and he says, yeah, man, I'll do it. Well, are you technically competent, Travis? No. Since you're not competent, that element's not met. So is there really even a contract? No,
Not an enforceable one.
it's not an enforceable one. Okay? So in that situation is, you have to make certain that all 6 elements must be there for it to be valid. If these elements are not here, then this second bullet, where we're talking about binding and enforceable, it's not there because it's not a valid contract. So talk about each one of these real quick. What are your 6 elements? Well, the first one is competent parties. Now, of course, in this situation is we have to understand that competent parties are going to be individuals that are, number one, either the age of 18, which is the majority, or number 2, they have not been mentally declared incompetent by a court of law. Just because you may think that they're incompetent doesn't matter. Wyatt, I mean, you may think, Jared, that Wyatt he's incompetent. You may think that, okay? I may think that, all right? But in the situation is, does it matter what me and you think? No, because in a court of law, are you incompetent, Wyatt? No, you're competent, okay? So in that situation is, in that this matter, it would be met that they're competent. Now, consideration, I'm going to test Wyatt here for a minute, see if he remembers. Consideration is always earnest money. Is that true? What's your answer? Say it loud so they can hear you online.
No.
No, why is it no? Think about it.
I know. It's not. That's what I need to know. But I'm trying to think.
Earnest money shows what's called a serious intent, but it does not mean. So, for example, let me put it in easy term here. You go over and you tell Garrett, you and Garrett are best friends. You tell Mr. Garrett, you say, "Hey man, let's go eat at Chick-fil-A after this class." Okay? And you say, I got $2, but I'll buy the meal. Here's $2. Now, does that $2 cover you buying the meal that evening? No. So how could the $2 fulfill the consideration of purchasing the entire meal? It could. Okay. So in that situation, earnest money, oftentimes when you put a contract in, you'll do earnest money, and what that is if you're buying a house for $200,000, you'll put 1% down in the purchase price. Okay. Well, the purchase price is about, say, $200,000. You're going to put $2,000 down. All right. But Travis, does $2,000 buy the $200,000 house?
No.
Wish it did, right?
Nice.
Right? I'd be out there buying a lot of them today, right? But the thing is that the earnest money is only just showing a serious intent. I'm not playing with you. I'm serious about this. While with the options or the consideration is actually going to be the total amount of the purchase. So put it in y'all's terms. Consideration is if you're buying my house, you're putting up money to purchase my house. The money you're putting up to buy my house is consideration. Does that make sense? So if I'm selling my house and Wyatt, you tell me you're going to buy it for $200,000, when you transfer that $200,000, you met consideration. Does that make sense? Okay. Mutual agreement. Mutual agreement means that both parties have to agree to it. We can't simply say, "Hey man, Jared, you agree? Okay, you agree and I agree. Okay, we're good." Well, that could be, but there has to actually be a reason behind it. Okay. Another thing is there can't be any what we call duress. Say, for example, that Mr. Jacob wants to purchase a house, and he's looking to buy your house, Mr. Jarrett. Okay. And Mr. Jacob is considering it, and then all of a sudden, Stephen back there comes up behind you, puts a gun behind your head. Says, "You're going to accept Mr. Jacob's offer. If you don't accept Mr. Jacob's offer, I'm going to put a bullet through your head." Okay? Are you going to deny that offer if you got a gun to your head? Hell no, not at all. Nobody would. That's called duress. You're being put in a situation where it doesn't always have to be a gun. It could be blackmail. It could be something to a point that they could end up saying, "Well, you're going to accept Mr. Jacob's offer. I'm going to go tell the secret that I know about you." That's still duress. Okay? It has to be mutual agreement, meaning that it's voluntary. Does that make sense? It means that everybody is voluntary in this. There is no duress behind it. There is no forcing behind it. Okay? It also has to have a lawful objective. We have to make certain that whatever it is actually going to be lawful. Say that Mr. Garrett wants to purchase the property next to, say, Mr. Keith's in this situation. So Mr. Garrett wants to purchase property next to Keith so that he can flood Mr. Keith's property because they have a feud. Is that a lawful objective? No, it's not a lawful objective. It's not going to be allowed. What if Wyatt, he decides that he wants to purchase a property, and he's going to purchase the property because it's got the best soil in Brazos County, and he can make weed on it. He can grow weed out there. Is that lawful, Mr. Wyatt? Not in Texas. In Colorado, is it legal?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to be careful with the states when you're taking your test.
But in the Texas one.
But in Texas, no.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I want to add to this. That's why I bring this up every single class. This part we're talking about is the national exam. So you could be taking a test, and they could be talking about Colorado, and you're wanting to buy some property so you can grow weed. What happens? The answer is it's okay. It's a legal purpose because it's in Colorado. But if it says Texas, better be careful because that's a no. Do you see how this works? This is how they're going to treat you on the test. Okay. The next one is it has to be in writing. and it has to be signed by the parties as required by the statute of frauds. All right, so Mr. Travis is a real estate agent, and I'm a real estate agent, and I call Mr. Travis, he's got a listing, and I say, hey, Mr. Travis, my client, Mr. Eugene, wants to purchase your property. And we see you got it listed at 200. So my client wants to go on and offer 200,000. Will your client accept? So you call Mr. Stephan, your client, and he says, yeah, we'll accept it. And you call back and say, yeah, we accept the offer, 200,000. Are we under contract? What was that? Can you say a little louder for him?
No,
No, why is that?
it is not in writing.
It's not in writing, but
And it's not signed.
but it's in text. I texted you.
But it's not signed by the parties.
Oh man, you mean I gotta sign it too? Man, that's right. Just because I text, that's what a lot of people catch you, is they'll say, well, I text, or my favorite one, I emailed it, so it's in writing, and it's got my signature line on it. Does that hold up in court?
Yeah.
It's got to be in the promulgated forms that are promulgated by the state. An email is not promulgated. Okay? A text is not a standardized form. Both parties have to agree to let an email or a text suffice. And 99% of the time, it's not going to hold up in court, period. Okay? So again, you got to be careful. They're going to catch you on these things, but it has to be in writing and it has to be signed by the parties as required by the statute of frauds. Not the statute of limitations, and that's where they'll get you. It's the statute of frauds. And the last one, the most important one that everybody forgets and misses, is there has to be a valid legal description. Now, Mr. Jarrett, you've not been in the class before, so I'm going to pick on you for a minute, sir. My question for you is a valid legal description a street address? Why do you say no? I know you don't really know, but why do you say no? You're right, but why do you say that? So if I tell you my address is 123 Main Street, that technically leads you to my house and my mailbox. But really, why do we have 123 Main Street? What's the purpose of 123 Main Street? It's to tell who to come where. It's to tell the mailman where your property's at so he can drop the mail. So do you want to pay $200,000 for my my mailbox? You don't want to buy my mailbox for $200,000?
Well,
Come on now, $200,000. That's a.
Is it a nice mailbox?
yeah.
It is aluminum.
Buy a house for that. But I'm not buying a mailbox.
What?
Can you live in the mailbox?
Yeah.
No, you can't live in the mailbox.
No, then I don't want it.
You don't want the mailbox?
No.
Why? You want to buy my mailbox? $200,000, man. Hey, you can buy it down at Lowe's for $5 or so, but I mean, I'm selling it for $200. So again, we got to make certain that our valid legal description, we want to make certain in this situation that we end up that we're actually stating what four corners we're purchasing. You see what I'm saying there? You are correct, but you want to find out what corners am I buying of this property. I don't want just the mailbox. I want all four corners. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Now, before I go there, is everybody good on this? Does everybody understand this? Huh? Can you make copies of that and give to him real quick, please, sir? Just run that through there for me. Get him a copy of it, please, sir. All right. Now, the most important thing here, this is the next one. So once you have these, you have all 6 elements, guess what? You have a what contract, Wyatt? You have a valid, that top word up there. You have a valid contract. You have all 6 elements, boom, you're valid. Okay? It's an valid enforceable contract. Okay? However, we're going to give you some, as always, there's always hypotheticals and issues here. But the very first one we want to start with is a contract with the minor is voidable by the minor. So here's the best part. Let's go back for a minute. Okay? So let's go here. A minor technically could have all of these things, couldn't they? They technically could. However, legally, they're not competent. But can a 16-year-old know how to hustle a person? Yeah, there's plenty. You ever were a student in high school and you're that student that put candy in your backpack and sold it in high school? You're a hustler. You're a competent person, right? You know what you're doing. But the thing is in the eyes of the law, you're not competent because you're not of age. Okay? But if you're a hustler, you probably can make some deals happen without them even questioning your age. Okay? So for example, this is actually true that you can actually, we can't do it anymore, y'all over the age of 6 or 18. But if you were 16, let's say that, for example, Garrett, he is, say, 16 years of age, all right? And he's a hustler. And he's got also a pen real quick, bro. Where you got a pen? If he ends up in a situation that Garrett goes over, and Garrett ends up, he has a house. You got one? If not, there's one on the front desk there. Just go grab it off the desk. You're good. You can go grab it. It's just off the front desk there. But say, for example, in this situation, Garrett has a car, okay, that he has on Craigslist that he's selling. 16 years of age. He wants a brand new car. He ends up, Wyatt goes and sees his listing. Wyatt contacts Garrett, says, hey, Garrett, how much you want for the car? Garrett says, you know what? I want to end up, actually, scratch that. I want to change, scratch what I just said. I want to flip it around. I want to make it more interesting. Let's do it this way. Let's put it a little bit different. Wyatt, you end up, you're selling a car. Garrett contacts you. Let's put it this way. It makes it a little bit more interesting for everybody. You're selling a car, Wyatt. You ask $5,000 for an old beater. Okay? It's old Ford, pretty beat up. Garrett calls you, he's 16, he says, I'm looking for my first car. Can I buy it from you for $4,000? He said, no, stuck, $5,000. Garrett says, all right, here's your $5,000. Drives off with it, and as with every 16-year-old, do they take it slow? No, they're flooring it. He's trying to race it. He ends up, he's racing through this car. He ends up, he blows the motor. Okay? Garrett blew the motor, comes back to you, says, I want to end up, I want my money back. What are you going to tell him, Wyatt?
Nope.
You're going to say, no. You get out of here. I ain't got time for you, Garrett. Get out of here. Garrett says, if you don't end up giving me my $5,000, I'm suing you. You say, go sue me. Okay? So Garrett turns around and he sues you. And he sues you under this doctrine. The doctrine of basically a voidable contract. He's a minor, therefore it is at his option to void the contract whenever he deems fit. And he gets to return you a car with a blown motor, and you got to give him his $5,000 back. That's why you don't want to contract with somebody that's a minor. Another thing is, if the person is incompetent, say Stephen in this situation, say he's over 18, he's been declared incompetent, he comes to you and says, I want to buy the car for $5,000, does the same thing, can Stephen get out of it? Yes, because he's incompetent. He's able to avoid the contract because he doesn't know what he's doing. Okay? So it's very important that you make certain that you don't do contracts with anybody, either a minor or an incompetent person. Guys, when I was first starting real estate, one of my earlier transactions was a lease, and the kid was emancipated. What's emancipated mean? Anybody know?
Separated by from his parents, don't want the parents to be his parents anymore.
Say that one more time so everybody can hear, please.
The child does not want the parents to be their parents. They want their freedom.
That's right. Child ends up in a situation the child wants to be on their own without mommy and daddy. They think that they're old enough. Okay? And in that situation, if they want to be emancipated, they want to go and be able to contract and all. The client that I was working with had not fully received the court order, was filed the paperwork, but had not been emancipated yet. They were in the process. They wanted to do a lease. I almost did the lease until I stopped and said, wait a minute, you're not fully emancipated. I don't have the order. I don't have the court order. There's not a court order. Just because it's in filing does not mean that that party is emancipated, meaning that they cannot contract. They have to have full legal order for them to be fully of age. And you can be emancipated at what age? Miss Linda, what age can be emancipated at?
16 years of age or younger.
You can end up being emancipated, and you can now be an adult and be treated as an adult. So if a person comes in and they say they're 16, say, Jared, I'm 16, and I walk in and I say I want to buy a house, don't simply say, yeah, get out of my office. You say, can I see your paperwork showing that you're emancipated? If they give it to you, they are treated just as though they were 18 years of age. Okay? So you got to be able to be aware of those items. Okay? Now, if there's going to be any fraud that has been committed by commission or omission, the contract is voidable by the non-fraudulent party. So if I fraudulently know that there, or say, for example, say I know in my house that I'm selling that there's termites. Okay? And Travis, you walk into my house, you're like, man, I love this house. And I'm like, oh, it's the best thing, man. Like the best thing since sliced bread. It's that good. You want to buy this house. And he says, well, are there any issues with structure? No. Everything's perfect, man. Everything's perfect. You should buy it. And Travis goes and purchases the house. Sure enough, a week after he buys it, he starts seeing termites. He calls me. He says, hey, I'm seeing termites. Well, that must have been you. You must have brought them in when you moved in. It was in your It was in your packaging. You packaged up your stuff and brought them in. What's he going to do? He's going to go get a pest inspector. Pest inspector's going to come out and say, this hasn't been something since you moved in. It's been here for years. And in that situation, I omit it. That's omission. I omitted stuff from my contract, did not disclose. So therefore, it is voidable at the option of Travis because I failed to fulfill my duty of disclosure. Okay?
That is only if you know about it. Right?
That's only if you know about it. Or it's kind of green, like a gray area here because some courts have even said if you should have known of it. So if it's like with termites, if there was a bunch of them outside and you see them, then you should have known of it. But if they were inside the structure and you couldn't have seen it, then you wouldn't be in trouble with that. So it's kind of, it's depends on the judge, basically. Now, if a seller's disclosure is required and not delivered, the buyer may terminate the contract until closing. We're actually going to spend time on this one when we get to that part of the course. But again, if the seller's disclosure is required and not delivered, then the buyer may terminate the contract until closing. Now, if a seller's disclosure is delivered and after the contract signed, the buyer may terminate the contract 7 days after they have received it. And that's another one that we're actually going to spend some time on when we get to that part of the course. We're actually going to talk about this one. Okay, it's very important that if you're going to be practicing real estate, it is very, very important that you get all of your stuff together. Okay, when you go in and you're listing a house by it, say you're going out to list, say for example, Mr. Jacobs' house. You're going to go out there, you're going to list his house. You need to get all your stuff together and you get it all signed as soon as quickly as you can. Okay, before you go put it on the market. Because the fact is, if you don't get that seller's disclosure completed and you don't get a contract, well, what ends up happening in that situation, Wyatt, guess what? Is you now just gave the buyer an additional 7 days that they can back out of the contract. So you literally, if they had an option period
Yeah.
for 10 days to do inspections, and you give them the seller's disclosure on the 11th day, you just gave them an extra 7 days to back out of the contract. So you give them 17 days. That's too long, okay? So in that situation, you want to have all your stuff together, okay? Now, sometimes, let's be real. We all understand this. We all know how real estate is. Real estate can be things where one day it works perfect, the next day it doesn't. Or sometimes you may end up, Travis may get somebody that calls. Jared calls Travis and says, hey, I'm looking to sell my house and I'm going to use the person that can get my property up in 1 hour. Well, in that situation, are you going to lose the listing, Travis, because you got to get all these documents to him? Or are you just going to list it bare bone, get it on the market so you get the listing? You're going to do bare bone, aren't you? Because you need to get it up. You don't want to lose the deal.
Yeah.
So in that situation, he's going to bare bone it. But the key thing is in that situation is, as soon as you get it on the market, you better be sending that stuff over to him to get him to fill that out. Okay? Because otherwise, and what I always do is sometimes I'll list a property just to get it on the market so I can get traffic coming. But I will not accept a contract until I have all my documents. So I'll get the contract, but I'll let my client know, hey, I got this contract, but before you do, I need you to complete the seller's disclosure so I can send it back with it, so that I remove the 7 days. Okay? Now, when a homeowners association, there's a resale certificate is delivered after the contract is signed, the buyer may terminate the contract for 7 days after receipt. So if there's an HOA that's required and the delivery's not been provided, okay, what ends up happening in this situation is that the buyer may terminate the contract for up to 7 days afterwards, because the fact is this, and this is kind of a key one with HOAs. Not so much here in Bryan College Station, but when you start going to Houston, so for my people that are from Houston, you need to be aware of this. Houston can have some crazy, outrageous HOA fees. I mean, outrageous. I had one that I had in Austin. Austin's another area that they wanted almost $2,000 a month for HOA on top of your mortgage payment. So how many of you want to pay $2,000 for your mortgage and $2,000 for your HOA? Okay. So again, you got to be careful, because these forms, when you get them, you need to let your clients know so your clients are aware of this material. Okay. Now, this is what we call, if you want to put next to this, if you want to put MUD, mud. Okay. And I'm not talking about the stuff that you go roll around in. Okay. MUD is actually what we call a municipality utility district. Okay. So when a property is located in a utility district or a statutorily created district that provides services under Chapter 49 of the Texas Water Code, it's going to establish the buyer's right to terminate if the seller does not provide the appropriate notice prior to the execution of the contract. So what happens here is, under a MUD, if you're in Houston, you will see this. I think we have currently one in College Station, and that's in the new area out there. Okay. So if you're selling any homes in the new area that's being built, you need to be aware of this. But if you're in Houston, you're going to need to do this almost for every transaction. Okay. And what happens is it is a utility district, and the people that live within that MUD district, guess what ends up happening? They have to you have to provide the buyer the information on what their dues are to that district. Okay. Sometimes it can be cheap. Sometimes it can go through the roof. Okay. But again, you have to let your clients know. And it provides the buyer a right to terminate if they don't receive this disclosure. Okay. Now, the two biggest ones here, and it's gonna have to play with this with me. You're gonna follow along here. So, when I am technically, if I submit a contract to you, wife, and I submit a contract to you, you counter it. We go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Are we executed or executory? Why do you say that? Why do you say executory?
Yeah, 'cause it's the process, right?
It's the enforceable contract is the process of being performed or fulfilled.
Executed when it's done.
It's done. So while we're negotiating, we're executory.
Mhm.
When we sign the contract, when me and you sign,
Executed.
we've now executed it. But guess what? We're now back into executory because now we actually have to fulfill all the terms.
So we go right back to.
Uh-huh.
That's
And then after everything's done and it's signed and funded, now what do we do?
executed
Now we're back to executing.
and done.
And we're done. Do you see how this works?
Yep.
Okay. So when you're dealing with these situations, the key thing that you have to understand here is that when you're negotiating, you're basically creating an enforceable contract. You're executory. You're in the process of creating it. When you sign, you have executed said contract, but you now are officially back in executory again because now you're in the process of fulfilling all the terms of that contract. Okay? But once everything has been completed and all promises in the contract have been fully made, you're now back to execute. Okay? So it kind of goes into a circle, is what it basically does. Now, the next thing here is you'll notice bilateral versus unilateral. Okay? Before I go into all of these that are listed, I want to test my students that I had previous class. Mr. Garrett, question for you, sir. You can turn on your microphone.
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Garrett, what's a bilateral contract?
When both parties promise to do something.
Very good. So it's a promise for a promise, right?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Keith, can you turn your microphone on for me?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Keith, what is a unilateral contract?
Unilateral is one-sided.
So it's
One promise to a particular party.
Excellent, excellent. Y'all remember, great job. So in that situation is unilateral is one person is promising, while a bilateral is it's a promise for a promise. So in a unilateral, Mr. Keith may say, hey, Justin, hold on. I don't want you selling your property until I do some inspections. So don't sell it. You agree not to sell it to nobody so I can do inspections. But if I find out after inspections that I like it, then I'm going to buy your property. So what happens there is you go from a unilateral to a bilateral contract because he first stops me from doing what I legally have a right to do. When we agree to the contract, we now have a bilateral. It's a promise for a promise. Do you see the differences there? Okay. Now, with that being said, now that we know that bilateral, and if you want to put notes to it, bi means two. If you want to put bi equals two. And if you want to put, instead of uni, you can put uno. What's uno? What's uno in Spanish? One. Okay. So in that situation, we have bi, meaning two promises, uno or uni, meaning one. Okay. So now that we know that, a buyer or independent contractor agreement. I'm going to ask my agents in the back here tonight. Independent contractor agreements. We understand it's a bilateral contract, but who's it between? Who are the two parties? When you got sponsored by your broker, you signed that. Who was the two parties, Stephanie?
The broker and agent.
The broker and the agent. The broker and the agent complete an independent contractor agreement. Okay? It allows the agent to act on behalf of the broker. So if you want to find out what you can do as a real estate agent, you read this form right here. You want to know what you can do as a real estate agent? Here's your rules. Here's what you can do. As a lease, Mr. Saul, as a lease, sir, who's that going to be between?
The tenant and the lesser lending out.
The tenant or the land, or the tenant and the landlord.
Yeah.
Are going to be your two parties there. You have your two parties because the fact is tenant's renting from the landlord. So those are going to be your two parties. Either Mr. Grossman or Mr. Stahl, option to terminate. So there's only one party. Who could that be? It would be the same for both of those.
It could be either party.
Huh?
So it could be either party.
It could be either party, but which one is it most of the time?
Buyer.
The purchaser.
The buyer or the purchaser, okay? Because the fact is, the buyer may end up after doing inspections, may want to terminate. They may exercise their right to terminate. The option to purchase. The buyer, of course, wants to have a right to purchase the property, okay? So while the option to terminate could be a seller, 99% of the time, these two bottom ones are going to be the buyer. That makes sense, okay? Now, listing agreements. Now, I know some of these are completely different forms to you, and that's completely fine. But first, let's define this. What is a listing agreement, Mr. Stahl?
Basically, it's an agreement that if you're selling your house, I have the right to sell it. I'm listing the property.
So you have the right, if I'm selling my house, I'm letting you as my agent list it for me, sell my property for me. That's correct. So in that situation, we would complete a exclusive right to sell. Is that correct, Mr. Stahl?
Yes.
Now my question, it says bilateral here, so that means there must be two parties, okay? My question for you, Mr. Stahl, in this situation is, we know the listing agreement is between the agent and the seller, okay? So that's our bilateral, that's two. My question though is, who's the agent? Is it you as a real estate agent, or is it your broker?
I believe it's me as a real estate agent. I don't remember.
The broker.
Okay.
So while they use, and that's where that's normal. When you sign a contract, and this is something that I'm glad you did that because I was kind of hoping you would, so I'd catch some people. This happens a lot. And this is for everybody listening online. You may want to take these notes here because when we get to agencies, this is going to be something y'all need to be aware of. Any contract is written between either the seller and the agent or the buyer and the agent. But the agent, if it's a contractual agreement, is always going to be the broker. Now here's where it gets tricky, okay? So Mr. Stahl is sponsored by me. Mr. Stahl goes out and he solicits business for himself and he signs contracts with his name on it. He signs the contracts. That's legal. He's signing as what's called a broker associate. Okay. However, he is signing those contracts on whose behalf? On the broker's behalf. His name's on it, but if we go back for a minute, we look right here at this first bullet, independent contractor agreement. By him signing an independent contractor agreement, I am telling Travis that you are more than welcome to sign contracts on my behalf. So he's like my power of attorney. You see what I'm saying? He's going out soliciting business for himself, but when he's contracting, he's not a broker, thus he does not have legal grounds to sign, but he's signing on behalf of his broker. That's why if you see at the bottom, it says broker's associate, meaning he's signing on my behalf. Does that make sense, Wyatt? See that look there on your face?
No, I got
You good? Okay. So can you already see when we get to agencies, how agencies is going to be, woo,
all over.
see what I'm saying? So, when we're talking about exclusive right to sell, they're bilateral. It's between what we call, if you want to use the legal terms, it's the principal and the agent. The principal is either going to be the seller or the buyer, and the agent is always going to be the broker. Okay? But on the licensing exam, guess what they're going to do? They're going to get you because the fact is they're going to go over and they're going to end up, they're going to say that the agent is the real estate agent because that's what you're called. Okay? Once you become a broker, you're not called a real estate agent, you're called a broker. Okay? But as a real estate agent, you're always called an agent. Okay? So that's why a lot of times is when I talk to people, I often say this is my associate. Okay? This is my associate. The reason I say that is that they don't assume through implied implication that they are the agent, that they're the broker. Okay? Now, an open listing is a little different. So let me explain the exclusive right to sell. You were in the class last time. An exclusive right to sell is basically this. Exclusive right to sell is no matter who brings the contract, okay, that individual is still going to be paid. So if Travis lists my property for me and I bring my own buyer and he has an exclusive right to sell, Travis still gets paycheck. Even if I did my own stuff, Travis still gets paycheck.
I like those ones.
You like them, don't you? Under an open listing, that's the bad part. Okay? Under an open listing, what happens is I basically say everybody can go sell my property, including myself, and whoever brings the buyer, it's a paycheck. Now, do you want to work that one? No, not at all. Okay? So that is a unilateral contract. It only benefits one person. Therefore, in this situation, an open listing is I'm letting anybody list my property, but whoever brings it gets a paycheck. Okay? Now, a buyer tenant, let me back up for a minute. I want to emphasize on this open listings. While it is a good concept, it's a good theory. If you're a seller, yeah, you would love this. Okay? But the problem is I can tell you, there's a couple of places that have been listed here in town with an open listing. And yeah, brokers will put it online, but do you think they're going to put any effort into showing it? Do you think any other agents are going to show an open listing? No, because they may or may not get a paycheck. It's not worth their time. Yeah, it's a waste of their time. So they're not going to show it. So while it may sound like a great theory, ultimately it's actually the worst thing you can do. Okay? Because your property most likely is not going to get any showings. Okay? Now, under a buyer-tenant representation agreement, in this situation, a buyer-tenant, of course, as it says, it's a representation to either represent a buyer or a tenant. Okay? Now, with that being said, it is a bilateral. So, Mr. Grossman, who are going to be the two parties in a buyer-tenant?
The buyer and the tenant.
Buyer or the tenant, and who else?
The landlord.
Nope. Representation. So therefore, it's going to be a
agent.
It's going to be an agent. So it could be either a buyer or a tenant as one,
Oh yeah.
and then a agent as the second, which would be the broker. Okay. And the buyer-tenant representation agreement, for those of you that are completely new to real estate, never knew anything how this works, it is actually in your benefit to sign one of these buyer-tenant representations. The reason being is because of the fact is if you don't sign a buyer-tenant representation, guess what happens? Say, for example, that Mr. Keith, he does not want to sign a buyer-tenant representation. He just wants me to go look at houses. He wants to go buy a house, but he wants me to just go with him and show houses. Well, that's a wonderful thing. I go out there, I'll show you houses. But here's the thing, is if I don't have a buyer-tenant representation agreement, who do you think my duty is to if I don't have a buyer representation agreement?
Yourself.
No, sir.
The seller.
The seller. So in the situation, Mr. Keith calls me and says, hey, I'm going to go look at Jarek's property. Okay, I'll go show you, Keith. Keith, do you want to sign a buyer? No, I ain't signing nothing. Okay. So I go out here, I show Mr. Jarek's property, who's listed by Mr. Wyatt. I go show the property. Mr. Keith goes in and says, man, I really like that property. I could offer list price, but let's do 100,000 under. Okay. Well, guess what? Since I don't have a buyer-tenant representation agreement, guess what I got to tell Wyatt? Hey, Wyatt, my Mr. Keith, who I just showed, he said he would pay list, but he wants to do 100,000 under. Is that okay? No.
Yeah.
But he wants to do that.
That's
Too bad.
too
That's what happens. Legally, if you do not have a buyer-tenant representation agreement, your duty is to the seller, even though you don't represent the seller. So even if you work for Keller Williams, we say, Wyatt, and I work for my own brokerage, two separate brokerages, you got the contract with Jarek, Keith just finds me off the, realtor.com, and I go show the property. Since Keith does not have a representation, we don't have a contractual agreement, guess what happens? I am a sub-agent of you, meaning that now, even though we don't have an agreement, I have to disclose whatever Keith tells me to you. That's why, as an agent, it is important, extremely important, that you tell your clients that they need to have a buyer rep, because otherwise your duty is to the seller. So whatever you tell me, I have to now tell the seller. And any advice you want from me, I have to tell the seller that I gave you that advice. See a problem there? Okay. So in that situation, we have to make certain that we are creating these legal contracts. It's just like this, guys and gals. If you ever had to hire an attorney, your attorney makes you sign a contract. Why? Because anything that you talk about does what? It stays between you and that attorney. But if you don't end up having that attorney contract, you don't have that client confidentiality. Therefore, that attorney could blab your business everywhere. Okay? There's a reason behind it. And it also puts duties on the broker. So when you sign this form and you slip up and say it, it protects the client that they can come back and sue for breach of contract. Okay? Last one, purchase agreements. Now I want to really test my agents here. Mr. Grossman, Mr. Stahl, who are the two parties to a purchase agreement?
The buyer and the broker.
The buyer and the seller.
Why do you say the buyer and the seller, Mr. Stahl?
Because it's an agreement between the two of one to purchase the other one's house or property.
Exactly. It is between the buyer and the seller. And I was hoping one of y'all was going to say the broker. Even though the broker's information is put on this contract, the broker never signs that contract. But wait a minute, Mr. Nobles, hold on. What if my client, Mr. Jarrett, says, hey, I'm going out of town and you're my agent. Can you go sign the contract for me? What do you think, Mr. Stahl?
No.
Mr. Grossman?
Unless I have power of attorney,
But he's out of town.
can't do it.
You can't do it, but he's out of town. Sorry. There you go. Sorry.
Is what
Sorry,
it is.
Derek. We can't help you, man. But yeah, that's the thing. You cannot legally, just because you represent them as an agent, you don't have power of attorney. You don't have, now, best practices, should a real estate agent ever be power of attorney in a transaction, in a real estate transaction? What do you think?
It'd be useful, but I don't know if I'd want to, because then you take all the accountability as
Yeah.
well.
Exactly. Real estate agents should never be a power of attorney for their client. I've been asked that before. Never. Because the reason why, if you read the power of attorney says that you have to have no financial interest. And if you're representing them as a real estate agent, do you have a financial interest? Yes, you're going to make money out of that transaction. Therefore, you cannot be their power of attorney, period. Okay? Now, if it comes down to it, and I've had this happen before, a client was actually basically on their deathbed. They could not really sign. They couldn't do anything. You as the brokerage, nobody in the brokerage can sign because they're all one. But you could ask a third party, a neutral third party, to be that power of attorney to sign on their behalf. But it is never acceptable for a real estate agent or a real estate broker to serve as power of attorney in a transaction that they deal with, even if it's in the same office. Okay? Now, the next and most important one. This is huge. Like this is humongous. Okay, I'm just going to be very, very serious here. This, if you want to get sued, here's the spot. This is the spot where you get sued at, okay? The key points here is reasonable time, and time is of the essence. Those are the two terms you need to be very, very, very familiar with, okay? It's the legal language that should only be written by who? An attorney. But I'm a real estate broker, Mr. Stahl. I'm a real estate broker. I'm from the country. I've been doing this for a long time, Mr. Stahl. I've been doing this for 30 years. I should be able to do it, right, Mr. Stahl?
That sucks, bro.
Why can't I do it? I've been doing it forever.
You were not an attorney.
I'm not an attorney. I cannot, no matter how long I've been practicing real estate, I cannot write legal language. It is against the law. Okay? Another thing is, it is contained in the printed portion of paragraph 23 of all 6 promulgated forms. And it's also included in 4 addendas. Now let me explain why this is important. Okay? The most important reason why there is the reasonable time and time is of the essence is because of the fact many real estate agents like to think that they can hem-haw around. Mr. Jared here, you just got a contract and you ended up, you just kind of put it on the side. You said, I'll deal with that after I DJ tonight. Then you get up the next day, I'm tired, I'll deal with it tomorrow. Okay? Time is of the essence. Does that mean you just take your own time and do whatever you want? What does that sound like to you, Mr. Jarrett? Huh? Mean to be fast or be slow? What do you think?
So
Fast. Needs to be fast. Time is of the essence means you better be on top of your game. If I tell you that this thing needs to be done in 14 days, does that mean you got 15 days? If I tell you to be at your DJing job at 8 o'clock, are you going to show up at 10 o'clock? No, what would happen if you do that? Did you lose that gig? Yeah, exactly. So in that situation, it's the same concept here for everybody, okay? Is that we got to make certain that we stay on top of our game, okay? So it's got to be contained in all portions of paragraph 23 and is included in 3 addendas. It is extremely, extremely important that you make deadlines. Whatever your deadlines are going to be, they need to be mentioned, okay? So for example, say that Mr. Grossman gets a contract, okay? Mr. Grossman, it says you have 10 days to exercise all of your inspections. You have 10 days, sir. Mr. Grossman goes over, he's got 10 days. He ends up, he says, all right, I'm going to get to it, but I'm going to wait 4 days before I do inspections. Did you waste days, Mr. Grossman? Yes, you did. And because you wasted days, guess what ends up happening? You ended up, you breached your time is of the essence and you could be sued. It is imperative that when you're under contract, you need to meet your deadlines like that, like clockwork. I tell people this all the time. When you are in a contract, if you're on the buyer side, the first 7 days that you are on the buyer side, that's where you're going to have headaches. Okay? On the first 5 days or the first few days of the option, that's where you're going to run into headaches because you're going to have to be on top of stuff. Okay? Poor Mr. Grossman, he's ended up in the past 2 days, he's been on a roller coaster ride. Okay? But that's the thing about real estate. Real estate's not something where it's easy. You think real estate is easy and you're going to make a ton of money and have no headaches? You're in the wrong field. Okay? Yeah. Mr. Stahl's getting up here. You got to know about that wasp honey back there.
I don't want to talk about it.
But no, what ends up happening in this situation is you got to be on top of your game. Okay? You got to be on top of everything. You got to meet your deadlines. You got to stay on top of it. You miss a deadline, you end up not only causing your client to be in trouble, but you cause yourself to be in trouble. Now, what exactly is these amendments and addendas? We talked about this previously. If you want to write a little note or you want to underline the top word, I want you to underline amend, A-M-E-N-D, and I want you to underline ADD. Now, Mr. Jarrett, I got a question for you, sir. What's the word to you, amend? What does that sound like to you, sir? To make changes. Okay? So in an amendment, it equals changes. So if you want to put underneath amend changes, that would be helpful. Okay? Now, Mr. Jarrett, next question for you. What's ADD? And what's that mean? You add something to it, right? So amend in the situation is we're changing something in the contract, while addenda is we're adding something. So one we're changing, the other we're adding to. Okay? So an amendment changes to a contract that must be in writing and signed by all parties. Very key there. To make changes to a fully accepted contract, amendment must be used. Okay? So what happens in this particular situation is if Jared, you're in a contract and your client tells you, for example, client says, you know what, Jared, I ended up, I wanted to end up having 7 days, but instead I need 10 days. The contract's already signed, you got to do an amendment. You see what I'm saying? And all parties must sign it, not just one person. All parties have to sign it. So it is imperative that if you ever need to change a contract after, this is the key point here, an amendment is only used after a fully accepted contract has been done. So if me and Travis, we're back and forth negotiating, and I'm back and forth, we're going, we don't need an amendment because the fact is we're negotiating. But the minute the last person signs on that dotted line, then what happens is it's fully accepted. Now we have to have an amendment. Does that make sense? Okay, that's what an amendment is used for. It's only for after the amendment or after the contract has been signed. Now, an addenda, like we said, and Jared put it, it's to add. Okay, we're adding additional material, and it's going to be in writing and signed by all parties, and it's going to be attached to and made part of the initial agreement. Now, courts only consider what is in the contract and no outside information. So it must be attached and listed in paragraph 23 of the contract for it to be part of the contract. If you were in the previous class when we talked about law of contracts, one of the key things that I spent time on and I harped on in the very last lecture was I harped on the matter that a lot of people will add stuff to the contract, but they don't check the boxes. So they'll add a third-party financing addendum or a non-realty items addendum or an HOA addendum, okay? But in paragraph 23 of the contract, they didn't even mark it. So by the courts, it's not even considered because it's classified as outside information. So if you end up, when you're filling a contract out, you better make certain that you're Xing those boxes. Because if you don't put the box, say why you go and your client needs financing. So your client says, I need third-party financing. I need a lender to give me a mortgage. You say, all right. You go in, you fill out the third-party form, but in the contract itself, you don't mark it. You just put it all together and you send it over to Stephen to sign. Stephen's going to say, I ain't accepting this because you didn't mark the box. So in that situation, it's like it doesn't even matter. It's classified as outside information and it don't even go with the contract. Just because you complete it does not mean it automatically goes with it. See how this works, okay? Now, what are we talking about? Performance of contracts and discharges of contracts. All right? Well, when we're talking about this situation, performance of contracts and discharges of contracts, again, these are your different ways. So how do we perform and how do we get rid of them? That's basically what we're saying. Each party has rights and obligations in a contract. That's period. That's simple. Remember, you're either doing something or you're not doing something. But both parties have something to do. So many of the obligations are going to have a time limit from the effective date of the contract. So we do not write contracts with an indefinite period of time. They're not valid. They have to have a deadline. Okay? That's why I tell people when I'm counseling people, I tell them, treat your life like you treat a contract. You got a deadline. Set a deadline. When you set a deadline, guess what ends up happening? You're going to reach the deadline, but you got to make it. Okay? If I say, hey, I want to lose 50 pounds by 2021 or the end of 2021, I got a deadline. I know what I need to be doing. Okay? But in the same situation, if I just say I want to lose weight, okay, we all want to do that. But the fact of the matter is, it's an indefinite period. Do you think it's ever going to happen, Jared? No. Okay? It's not. It just doesn't happen. I'm on that right now. I'm on the, hey, I want to lose weight, but I haven't set a deadline. So what hasn't happened? Okay? You have to set time limits. There has to be a time limit. Of course, the effective date is going to be an important section of the contract to establish an effective date. Okay? Very important. You do not ever receive a contract without an effective date. If you sign a contract, you fully execute that contract, and you get it all the way to the end, and you don't have an effective date on that contract, guess what? That contract's worthless. Okay? Because the fact is it hasn't actually ever started. Okay? Now, in this situation, we're going to talk about assignments and novations. Okay? Actually, I want to back up for just a second, real quick on this one. We talked about performance. Performance is basically ends up, you got to do what you got to do. Okay? Discharge of contracts is this kind. And this is very important. A discharge of contract is this. A discharge of contract is where you have fulfilled your duties. But there's another thing is, under a discharge, it doesn't always mean you have to complete the task. For example, I want to end up buying Mr. Eugene's house from him. I put the contract in, I'm doing inspections, I'm doing everything I'm supposed to, and I wake up one morning and the house is gone. The house collapsed. Okay? That'd be my luck, by the way. And the house just collapsed. Can I legally perform on that contract, Mr. Grossman? No. Why do you say no?
Because the property is no more. It's
Property gone. Property's gone. You want to buy property with no house? No.
gone.
That's how you buy a mailbox.
That's how you buy that mailbox. That's right. So in that situation, guess what? I ain't buying a mailbox for $200,000. I want out of that contract. So what happens is sometimes discharge the contract does not always mean performance. Sometimes acts, as they call acts of God, happens. And if that happens, I have no control over it. Mr. Eugene had no control over it, but there should no longer be a contract because there's no longer a house. Okay? It's the same concept with anything else. Is there are going to be things in a situation where they may or may not end up playing together. Okay? Where you may end up, I may be purchasing Mr. Wyatt's property in Colorado because it's got the best soil to grow wheat. So I'm buying his property. Then all of a sudden, Congress goes in, Congress goes in and says, now it's illegal to have wheat. Well, is it going to be worth me to buy his property anymore? No. Okay? So again, you have to look at these situations and you have to determine it. That's why there is no full solution. It's all case by case. Okay? That's why I tell people all the time. They'll say, well, just standardize everything. I'm like, how do you standardize life? Wouldn't it be nice if we had a repetition of every single day, everything happened the exact same way every single day, and we knew what it was going to be? It'd be nice, right? No, it'd be boring, real quick. Okay? So in that situation it's just like real estate. One day, you may think everything's going perfect. And the next day, what happens, Stephen?
Back to God.
It's gone. You lose a house, transaction does what? Falls apart. Agents lie. It's how it is. And let me tell you, I tell people this all the time. it's not just, everybody thinks, well, it's just real estate. Real estate's like that. No, if you really think about it, no matter what job you have, something always goes wrong. Jared, you DJ, does your equipment every single time work? No problem. It's all perfect every single time? No, it ain't perfect. What happens? Maybe one of your systems ain't working, or your mixer's not working, or this ain't working, your laptop's glitching, or who knows, right? It's life. We have issues, okay? You got to learn how to deal with them. You got to learn how to take the punches, as they say, roll with the punches. Guys, I've been there, done it many, many times, and I still will do it. But that's what matures you. It's what makes you who you are, right? It's what makes you the man who you are and woman who you are, by learning to end up rolling with the punches. You end up, if you quit easily, this is not your field, okay? Travis and I, if you ever get a chance, talk to Travis about wasp hunting, okay? If you ever get a chance, talk to Travis about wasp hunting. Because my question, Mr. Derek, do wasps make honey? No. He almost lost the transaction because the wasps, see, even Garrett heard that. Yeah, wasps don't make honey. But he almost lost a whole transaction over wasp honey that they don't even make. Okay?
They wrote an amendment that I have to get rid of the wasp nest in the attic along with all the honey that is produced.
Yes. For those of you that did not hear online, Travis received an amendment. Talking about an amendment right here.
It was the day of closing.
Receives an amendment the day of closing.
15 minutes before.
15 minutes before closing, that told them that the sellers had to remove the wasp nest and all honey that was with that wasp nest before the buyer would close.
Now you know everybody's looking up to see if they actually do make money.
Yes, everybody's looking up
I'll
online.
tell you they don't. They do not.
We looked it up. They don't.
But yes, in that situation yes, wasps do not make honey, but you will run into situations like that. You'll run into some crazy, unique situations that you as a real estate agent, you have to bite your tongue or bite your bottom lip and just say, okay, I'm just going to roll with this, okay? And you have to have a sense of humor, guys, I promise you. If you want to get into this, you got to have a sense of humor, because I promise you, it's going to be nothing but headaches sometimes, but it's funny headaches most of the time. And you'll always have those entertaining sessions, you can say, with different people, okay? Now, getting back to this in the same situation, going back to assignments and novation, okay? Assignments and novations in that situation, if you end up, assignment novations are going to refer to a transfer of rights or duties under a contract. A buyer may transfer interest to another legal entity unless it's prohibited by statute, or it is going to be written through an assignment of the parties. Okay? And so what I mean to this situation and what I'm talking about here is we want to make certain that we go over here and we end up that we are ensuring that our assignments in this situation is that we want to ensure that when you are assigning any rights, okay, no matter what it is, we want to make certain that those rights are going to be stipulated. So for example, have any of you ever heard of, I'm going to ask my Houston people here, have any of you ever heard of wholesaling? Wholesaling. W-H-O-L-E, sailing. Wholesaling. What's wholesaling, Mr. Grossman?
It's getting a product for cheaper and then selling it higher, or you could buy it for what the like stores buy it for.
That's correct. Wholesaling is basically in this concept here. Wholesaling is, Mr. Jarrett, you are just a homeowner, and I come to you and I say, Mr. Jarrett, I want to I'm going to buy your house from you for $100,000. You're like, man, that's a steal. I paid $50 for it. I'm going to take $100,000. What you don't know is it's worth $200. So I go over to Mr. Wyatt and I say, hey, Mr. Wyatt, I got you a deal, man. I'm selling this $200,000 property for $150,000. You want to buy it from me? He's like, heck yeah, I'll buy it. 150 for 100 or 200,000. Heck yeah. What you don't know is I bought it from him for 100. I already have a contract between me and Jarrett for 100. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to assign my interest in the contract to you with the one piece of paper. Now the contract's between you and him, and I walk away with $50,000. Do you see how this works? Now, if you're going to do wholesaling, you cannot do wholesaling if you're a realtor. And the reason it doesn't work is because of this. If you're a realtor and you do wholesaling, you have to give disclosures, meaning you have to tell him what his property is actually worth. Okay? So imagine going over here telling Jared, hey, I'll buy your house for $100,000, but by the way, it's worth $200,000. You think he's going to sign that contract? Nope. He's going to be like, heck no, you lost your mind.
Yeah.
I ain't doing that. So an assignment, basically, it transfers the rights and duties under a contract to another person. Okay? So a party may transfer their interest to another legal entity unless it's prohibited, of course, by statute or a written agreement by the parties. However, they can end up in some situations, they can assign their interest to another person. Okay? I could, like I said, I could get it under contract with you. I assign it to you, Mr. Wyatt. Mr. Wyatt, then you purchase the property. Once it's all said and done, I'll walk away with a $50,000 check. Okay? There are a lot of real estate agents that do this. A lot of not real estate agents, but the spouses of real estate agents. So say, for example, Jared, you are married. You have your wife with you. You're a real estate agent. Your wife could go do wholesaling deals while you're doing the research. Do you see how that works?
Yeah.
Same thing with you. You can do the same thing. Mr. Travis, recently married, he could have Elizabeth end up, go out, he can look at the stuff, find the deals, go do the negotiating, and he can run all the comps. There's nothing illegal about that. It's allowed. Because Elizabeth is not a licensed real estate agent. Mr. Small, on the other hand, is. Okay? So in that situation, you have to be very careful. Now, it also is the replacement of an existing contract with a new contract. It's called a novation. So, unlike the first one with an assignment, you're just assigning your rights away. With a novation, you're actually you're terminating the old contract to create a brand new one. Okay? And a novation often occurs in commercial properties and sometimes in leases. Okay? When they're subleasing. Sometimes a sublet will actually be able to get a novation where they're just completely different lease and it starts all over from scratch. But again, these are your two different terms. Now, I'm going to spend not a lot of time, but I want to spend some time on this one because of the fact is it's very interesting. Okay? It's always interesting. And y'all probably are like, oh, another thing. And he's at the end of this class. Why doesn't he call it? I'm tired. But what I'm about to tell you is very helpful. Okay? So what ends up happening in this particular situation, we talked about statute of frauds. Mr. White, what statute of frauds? Contracts must be in.
What?
Contracts must be in.
What, written form?
Must be in writing.
Yeah.
That's statute of frauds.
Okay.
Okay? Statute of limitations, are they the same thing, Mr. Grossman? Why are you shaking your head no?
Because they're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing. Well, let's see here. Statute of limitations. If a party defaults under the contract and the other party chooses to sue for specific performance and or damages, that suit must be filed within the statute of limitations time period. So this doesn't deal with writing. This deals with suing people. Okay? So here's the key thing I want y'all to understand. The statute of limitations, of course, is going to vary by state. So it depends on if you're national or state. But in Texas, how many years you got? 4. You have 4 years from the contract for sale of real estate to bring a lawsuit. That also applies to many other types of contracts. How many of y'all in here have a credit card? 1. 2. Okay? 2 people. Do you know that most of the time, So also, of course, y'all know I do almost everything. But one of the things that I end up do is credit repair. Well, what normally happens to people that have bad credit is 99% of the time they get themselves in the hole, they start paying minimums. It is not a wise decision to pay minimums at all. Does that make sense? Reason being, are you ever going to get out of debt if you're paying the minimums? No, never. You're set up to be set for failure, period. Okay? So when we're dealing with minimums, what I always tell people is just stop paying your credit cards. Stop paying them. Because under the rule, you have 4 years for them to sue you. Well, if you stop paying January of 2021, when do you think they're finally going to send your bill to a collections company?
January 2025.
It'll probably go about July. It normally takes about 6 months that they'll initially send it. Okay? But here's how it works. So Travis, you owe me money. I'm a bank. Okay? You stop paying. After 6 months, I'm writing it off. It's a bad debt to me. But I sell it off to Jarrett here for basically pennies on the dollar. I'd rather get something than nothing. So you owed me, say, $10,000. I sell it to Jarrett for $5,000. Now, Jarrett, if you can collect the money, you just doubled your cash. Not a bad deal, right? And I got some money, not all of it, but I got most of my money. I got half of it. So I wrote it off. And I give you whatever I have, I give it to you. Do you think I still have the original contract if I'm a large commercial bank? Nope. That stuff's long gone, especially if that credit card's like over 5 or 10 years. I've lost that. Okay. So Mr. Jarrett, you just get some form saying that he owes me some money. Okay. So I give you that. So Jarrett starts trying to collect from you. You think he's gonna get any money out of Travis? Nope. So Jarrett, you're like, you know what? I'd rather get some of my money back. I'm gonna go sell it to Wyatt for $2,500. So you sell it to Wyatt. I understand you had it for about a year. I had it for 6 months. So a year and 6 months is already lapsed. Give it to Wyatt. Wyatt buys it for $2,500. Wyatt tries to start collecting. Year goes by. He goes up. He sells it off to Stephen. Stephen buys it, $1,250. He starts going to go over here. He's hustling. Well, by the said and done, finally Stephen ends up, he says, well, I'm going to sue him. What time do you think it's been? How many years has gone by the time Stephen comes into the picture to sue him?
It's probably been 4 or 5 years.
More than 4 years. Well, more than 4 years. So 4 years has lapsed. So now, Travis, you get a lawsuit. Guy walks out, you've been served. He looks at it, he's like, that deal? That was like 5 years ago. But no, what did most people actually do in these situations? Did they say that? No. Oh my God, I'm getting sued. Oh my God, I need to pay it. I need to call Stephen right away and pay it. And they pay it. What actually needed to happen? They just needed to tell the court, Your Honor, it's been over 4 years. Since it's been over 4 years, I don't have to pay the debt.
Does that happen a lot?
Huh?
Does that happen a lot?
Yeah.
It does?
Yeah. I had one client that I helped save them over $100,000 in credit card debt. Huh? After 4 years, you don't have to pay no more. Now, that doesn't stop Stephen from harassing you. He's going to still try to collect it. But you can't force me to pay you.
4 years from what point? Like when
4
you
years
started?
from the last time you made your payment.
Or from the last payment you made?
From the last payment that you made. If you stop paying as of January, say you pay December and you don't pay January, 4 years starts from January.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense? You see why this stuff's very important here, guys? Because the fact is yes, it does apply to real estate, but it also applies to your daily life. That's why I tell people all the time when I see parents or people that are in the hole, they're in the debt, and they're like, oh my God, I need to pay my bills, I'm like, if your credit's already shot, just let it go. It's already shot. You know what I'm saying? Just let it go. Stop paying. Save that money that you were paying, put it to the side and come up for a savings account. Yeah, if you had 10 cards, you may get sued by 2 or 3 of them, but you already have a nice little savings account over here. And by the time he gets to Stefan, he paid $12.50 for the deal. Yeah, he's going to want $10,000 from Travis, but if Travis, you go over there and say, "I'll give you $2,500," you going to accept that deal? Oh, in a heartbeat, he would, because he doubled his money. Okay, so in that situation is you have to be aware of it. And most of the time, there are plenty of meals, what we call creditor meals, where they just file a ton of lawsuits. And if you respond, they drop the lawsuit. Because most people, when they get sued and get served, what do? Write a check. Okay? 99% of the time you respond, they let it go. Okay? So if either party accepts the earnest money, however, everyone is released from the contract. That's what I love. If my client defaults, if my client ever defaults on a contract, I'm the first one to quickly sign over that paperwork and send it over and release earnest money. If I know that Jarrett, my client, screwed up and Travis is working on the other deal, I'm sending Travis within a few moments. I'm sending Travis that paperwork to say, "Hey, here's the stuff. Here you go." You see what I'm saying? Okay. So in those situations, we need to make certain when we're dealing with these, we need to make certain that we fulfill our job. Okay. We need to make certain that we are doing our overall duty. You see what I'm saying? Okay. Now, the next one is what we call a breach of contract. Okay. And this is the biggest and most important one. A breach of contract is going to be a violation of any of the terms or conditions of a contract without legal consideration. Okay? So, in this situation, if there's any of the terms or the conditions and you do not fulfill your duty, you are in breach of contract. Okay? So, say for example in this situation that Mr. Wyatt, he signs a contract to purchase my car from me. And when it comes down to it, for him to pay me, his funds are no good. His check's bounced. In that situation, he's violated the term of the contract. Therefore, without legal reason, he's breached the contract. I can now sue him. Okay? If a buyer defaults, the seller can sue for damages or for specific performance. But forcing the buyer to buy the property is one of the key ones. This is why it is so important. Okay, and it's extremely important that whoever your broker is, y'all, it's extremely important that whoever you get sponsored by, that your broker is watching what you're doing. There are plenty of brokerages in this country, in this state, that they literally, you walk in and they're like, "Hey, Jarrett, okay, here's my signature. Bye, I don't ever want to see you again. Here, Wyatt, bye, I don't ever want to see you again." Or you'll sign up with them and their broker is in Austin and you're here in Bryan College Station. And that's fine. Don't get me wrong. That's fine in some situations. But what I'm saying in this situation is this. The broker doesn't even have communication with you. Some brokers like myself, I'm here in College Station. Yeah, I have agents around the state. But one thing that I try to do is I make sure I try to contact them at least once a month minimum. And I try to get out there at least every other month to go visit them. I try to make it a habit to get into seeing my people. But most brokerages, they sign you and you never see them again. And that's not good business. Because what happens, guys and gals, and I've seen this happen many times, new agent gets licensed. They're thrown out there. Wyatt, you go throw out there. Don't do a transaction. You're representing Mr. Travis back there. He's buying a house. You screw something up. You forgot to file something or whatever. Something happened. And in that situation, you ended up, Mr. Travis now breached the contract. Because of the breach, he lost his financing. Now he can't purchase the house. And Mr. Jarrett here is the seller, and he's like, he's going to buy my house. Can he force Mr. Travis to buy his house if Mr. Travis has no money? Yes, he can. Yes, he can. You can put your client in a situation where they have to buy the house even when they don't have the money. Yes. That's why it is extremely important. I can't tell you, Mr. Grossman's been in my office before. Well, I've sat down and he's like, well, just do it. No. Okay, well, if we do that, here's what it's going to lead to. My client now has to purchase a house that they have no money for. And then all of a sudden, what happens? Guess who's going to most likely get sued? It's me. Okay?
You're gonna get an earful.
That's right. It is imperative. It is imperative. Mr. Grossman can tell you, there are times that I end up myself that I have to get the earful. I have to deal with stuff because an agent misses something. It is my job. But trust me, once I get an earful, who do you think gets the next one? The agent. Okay? If I get an earful, you're getting an earful. It's only fair. So it is imperative that you understand that this is not a light business. This is not something that you take very lightly. You're putting people on the line where they may be forced to purchase a house and they have no money. Okay? If the seller breaches a real estate sales contract, the buyer may sue for damages or sue for specific performance. Say you end up screwing something up on the listing. You did something wrong. Because of your negligence, your seller didn't really want to sell a certain item. Maybe they have 10 acres and they ended up wanting to sell tract A and not tract B, but you screwed up and you put tract B for sale. And everything starts going along, and then they find out after it's all been done that you actually were selling this one and not this one. Well, now all of a sudden, because your neglect, your seller now has to sell the house that they did not plan to sell. And now all of a sudden, your clients are up a creek without a paddle. And imagine if you were selling tract B instead of A, and B is actually worth $400,000 more than what they were buying tract A for, and you caused your clients to sell or lose or take a large loss. They're coming after you and your broker. Okay? These are very important things and very important aspects as real estate agents that you have to be detail oriented. You have to be reviewing it. I can't tell you how many agents just write contracts willy-nilly and send them. Had a contract, an agent one time that was with my firm, ended up submitted a contract without me reviewing it. Because of their willy-nilly stuff of them just sending stuff, they almost cost our client a lot of money. Talk about that person got their tail chewed. I chewed them out. Because the fact is, just because you're a real estate agent, you still have to run it by your broker. There's always a key thing that you run it. Because like I told you, the agent, you're only an extension of your broker. You're not your own person. You're just an extension. You still need to have it. And it doesn't always have to be your broker. I mean, there can be somebody designated in the office. It could be, say, Travis. Say he's done a lot of transactions and he knows what he's doing. Okay, the broker's busy. That's fine. Then run it by Travis. Run it by somebody else who has experience. A second eye is always better than no eyes. You see what I'm saying? Okay? Now, what are other reasons for termination of a contract? Double check. Yes, perfect. Okay, so that's our last slide. So what are some other reasons for termination of a contract? Well, the most common sense one is substantial performance. Okay? If Wyatt, you fully complete a contract, then you're done, right? If you buy my house, you pay me cash, and I give you title, we're done. That's substantial performance. You've done everything you're supposed to. Okay? Partial performance is where you ended up, Wyatt, you're buying my house. Halfway through the transaction, a sinkhole occurs and my house gets swallowed up. Well, you did your part, did part of it, fell apart. It's not your fault nor my part. So in that situation, what ends up happening? It's done. I can't continue. Okay? Impossibility of performance also turns into that same situation. If we end up in impossibility, what happens here is this situation. Say, for example, say that Mr. Travis here, he's wanting to purchase my property, and the sole purpose of him purchasing it is because he's going to turn it into a commercial building. So that you're going to make it a commercial unit, okay? But what ends up happening here is, guess what? this unit that you're purchasing, or this lot that you're purchasing, the zoning and board come in, the committee comes in and says, well, this is now zoned instead of commercial residential. Well, it's pretty impossible for you now to do that because it's no longer commercial. Or some other law happens, some other thing happens, or the government comes in and takes it. There's many different ways that it can be impossible for you to perform. Mutual agreement of the parties. It could be simple as this. I'll walk in, hey, Jarek, I don't want to buy the house anymore. Okay, I don't even go sell it. All right, we're done. You can be that easy. And do you think real estate contracts are that easy? Very rare. Okay, very rare. But it could happen. Could also be by the operation of law, like we said, zoning could also create it. Or sometimes they can just be rescinded. Sometimes a contract can be offered and it can be rescinded by a what? A party that may be a minor or a party that's incompetent. Okay, they can come back and they can pull back on this. But again, these are other reasons that they can be the termination of the contracts. Okay, now that covers the slides for this evening. Now, what I want to kind of explain is, and kind of give you an overview of the class for the remainder, and what we're going to be doing is this. So, for the remainder of the class, you notice for chapter 2, we're going to talk about the laws, the rules, and regulations. And we'll discuss that tomorrow. But the key thing that we're going to end up doing, and the key thing we want to get into is this, is we are going to primarily be talking about the basis. Okay, we're going to create a basis in regards to the overall concept of the laws. As we progress, we're going to get into the overall content. Now, here's what's going to end up happening most likely. Like I said, in the previous law of contracts, there was 10 chapters. In this particular class, there's only 9. So what's going to most likely happen, since we have a relatively small class, we will most likely on the 10th class, y'all are actually going to end up, the 9th and the 10th class, y'all are going to present. Okay? And what I mean is I'm going to give you a hypothetical, give you a situation. And what I'm going to end up doing is y'all are going to draft up the contracts. And what's going to happen is you're going to be given the terms and you're going to draft up a contract and you're going to present showing me that you can fully complete a contract. Okay? If you are online, you will present through Zoom. If you are in person, you will come up here, you'll present your contract in front of everybody. Okay? It's a twofold reason on why I'm doing it. Number one is the fact of the matter is that I want you to be able to start feeling comfortable presenting in front of people. That's what real estate's about. You gotta be comfortable getting up here. Okay? Number two in the same situation is I need to make certain that you can actually fully complete a contract without any issues. Now, we will go through the contracts and we will explain it and kind of give you some information, but you need to have a working knowledge of exactly how real estate works. Okay? You'll need to be able to fully complete contracts without having to ask your broker. So one of the key things that I recommend that all of you end up doing, I would highly recommend, is that you go on to Trek's website, and when you go on to Trek's website, I ask you to go to the contracts place. And to do this, I'll pull it up real quick so that everybody can see what I'm saying. So what you can do is I want you to go to Trek's website right here. You can see their address right up here at the top. And what ends up happening is, if you come down here to contracts, and you go right here to contract the drop down, and you go right here to 1 to 4 family, and you hit download form, what ends up happening is there's the 1 to 4 family. Okay? You will need to know, and you will learn in this class over the next week and a half, you will learn everything that's in this contract. As you can see down here, actually, I'm sorry, they always put it up here. There it is right there. There's 10 pages. When I ended up real estate, it was 8. When my broker started, there was 6. So every year, it seems like it just keeps adding on every 4 years. There's another 2 pages. Okay. But what ends up happening in this is you're going to need to know every single thing within this entire part here. And we will go through this and we'll talk about this. But you need to read through this because you will use this form probably 80, if not 90% of your time as a real estate agent. Okay? You need to know this form inside, outside, upside down, and around. Okay? Because your client's going to ask you questions and you need to know what paragraph it is and where it's at. Because your clients are going to want to know. Another thing that we're going to be talking about, which we don't spend a lot of time on, is actually these addendas. Okay? We'll briefly go through these. But there will be in your contracts, in your hypotheticals that you're going to work on, there will be times that you're going to have to end up completing these forms. Okay? This class is going to be based more off of your knowledge of actually practical use of the forms, not so much off of memorization like the previous classes. Okay? I want to see practical usage. I want to see that, Wyatt, if I say this client comes in and I need you to draft a contract, I don't want to have to tell you what you need in the contract. I want you to fill it all the way out without me having to do anything. Does that make sense? The reason for this is that when you get out there, guys and gals, and Mr. Stahl and Mr. Grossman can tell you, when you get out there and you're really showing properties and your client finds that property that they want, you don't have time to go, Justin, can you come here and sit down and type a whole contract or show me how to start? No, you don't have time for that. You have to draft it like that. Okay? No ifs, ands, buts about it. You got to stay on it. Okay? If you're slow, you're not going to make it. You'll lose the deal, I promise you. Guys, when I got my own brokerage started, we were at the peak season in Bryan College Station. I am not kidding you. I put a house on the market. Literally within 30 minutes of me putting it on the market, I would have 5 people lined up to go show that house.
So you never know when it's going to be sold.
That's right. Yeah. You have to end up, you got to stay on it. You have to be able to draft. Wyatt, you go show Mr. Grossman a house, you get out there and you start walking around showing the house, and he's like, oh man, this is the house I want it right now. Draft the contract. And you don't know how to draft these contracts, what do you think is going to happen to you, Wyatt, as their client or their agent? They're dropping you. What are you going to do if that was $1 million house that you were showing him?
They can sign a buyer rent.
Yeah,
Shoot yourself in the foot.
you just pushed the toilet, flushing the toilet there, so $30,000.
30 grand.
So, how do you feel about that?
That's too bad.
Not happy at all. So again, if you get a chance, go through these contracts, know these addendums. Now, I'm not so much worried about you knowing exact paragraphs in the addendums, but I do want you to know what's in them. Does that make sense? Okay. When you get into real estate, of course, your broker, whoever you choose, the broker is ultimately going to end up, they're going to provide you a platform and all that you can get this and see more information. But ultimately, you need to know where they come from and what they consist of. I used to, a long time ago, I used to require my agents to go in and actually read every contract and sum up each paragraph in 2 sentences. Okay? And read an entire paragraph and sum it in 2 sentences. The reason I did that was because the fact is, when you're over here showing property, if I'm sitting here talking to you, Jared, and I'm trying to sum up what the third-party financing addendum is, and I start reading it verbatim to you, what are you going to think of me?
You don't know what you're talking about.
What the hell are you talking about? I don't know what this fool don't know what he's doing. Okay? The key thing is you need to be able to spat out what needs to be there. One of the biggest ones that a lot of new agents, I'll pull it up real quick. Right here. It's the biggest one that most new agents forget. That one right there. Non-realty items addendum. One of the largest ones that often is forgetted. Because the fact is, here's the thing. New word. So, but what happens here with the non-realty items addendum is this. Is what happens is, if there are any personal property in the house that's supposed to convey, say for example that Travis shows you a property, Jared, and you're like, man, I love that refrigerator. And man, I want this and I want that, and you're like, I want the dishwasher, the stove, the refrigerator, I want all these things. I want them to convey it. And Mr. Travis doesn't put this form in here,
You ain't getting it.
you ain't getting it. So I see that a lot when a new agent sends me a contract on one of my listings and I get it and this ain't in here. I'm like, I tell my seller, they didn't include it, so you take whatever you want. Then when it ends up closing, they do their final walkthrough. They're like, where's the refrigerator? Where's the stove? Where's the microwave? Where's everything gone to? Well, you didn't include it in here. The only things that must stay with the house, are these items up here, guys and gals. These items listed right here. Those items right there. Everything that's in B and C must stay with the house. If your client at any time wants to take, for example, say they want to take the curtain and rods, then they have to put it in D. If they want to end up taking the garage door openers, say they're universal garage door openers, they have to put it in D. Otherwise, if it's not in D, everything that's in B and C must convey. But if you notice when you're going through here, do you see refrigerator, stove, any of those things that are stated within these in B and C here?
They also have to be permanently installed.
They have to be permanently for it to be a fixture. So in this
That same
situation,
thing happened on my last
that's right.
VO2 where they complained about us taking the security cameras because it says security and fire detection equipment right there, but the security cameras that they had were just like basically ring cameras like the ones we have here in the office, just kind of screwed into the corner of the wall. They're not actually wired into the building, so they're personal property.
That's correct. Anything that is going to end up being a situation that it has to be permanent. It cannot be something like it's easily hooked. For example, if I put a camera right over here, Mr. Jarrett, on this wall on a hook, I can easily take it down just as simple as I can take this down. Did that cause any damage? No. But if it's permanently wired and I try to take it down, what's going to happen? I put a hole in that wall. You see what I'm saying? Which causes damage. Okay? So again, you got to look at these. But again, these are very important components. Mr. Stahl, Mr. Grossman, myself, or any other agent that I have up here, they can give you stories. Tons of stories. I literally am thinking about starting a book with all my agents this year with all the stories we have. Okay? Because the fact is, I can tell you many. That's why one thing as an instructor up here, I can tell you a story about almost anything that's happened. I can tell you. But the fact of the matter is you need to know these things so that you're aware. But again, anything that's in B and C, if your client wants to take them, then the client must include those in D. Okay? All right. With that being said, give me just a minute so I can stop recording, please.